We're going to talk about my mother's Suzanne Summers.
Oh, I love
What
it.
was the thing that she did that it was between your legs? What
The
was that?
Thigh
Thigh
Master.
Master,
Thigh
right? Is that
Master.
kind of where this all began? I mean, where did it begin for? Well, to bring us back to the history of it.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you say that because I think that a lot of people, and myself included as of a few years ago, kind of have this idea that women's fitness history began with the 80s, 90s, fitness crazes,
Yeah.
from Jane Fonda to Suzanne Summers. But part of why I wanted to write the book was because I discovered and I kind of just stumbled on this longer, richer history that really goes back. I mean, you could trace it back to like the beginning of time, but for the
Yeah.
purposes of my book, to the 1950s, which is when the kind of contemporary fitness industry began. So there are many, many fitness pioneers who paved the way, for better or worse, for Suzanne Summers. And I kind of tell, the rest of the story, so to speak, in my book.
And you said, so you're saying starting in the 1950s is when exercising became more popular in the mainstream culture? I mean, what was it really before then? Just smoking
Sure.
cigarettes and doing laps in the pool?
Yeah, if you were lucky. I mean, so basically, before the 1950s, and that's my research really began in full in the 50s, but there were periods in American history when women were more active, were encouraged to, to exercise in a pretty gentle way. But in the 1950s, so this was the post-World War II era when there were really strict gender norms enforced. After the war, when so many women had gone to work, there was this sort of fear that women had been masculinized and there was no going back. And so as the troops returned home, it was kind of like the country just needed this reassurance that men were still men and women were still women, whatever that meant, and that the proper social order was still in place. So what that meant in the context of the story I'm telling is that women were really discouraged from being strong, from cultivating muscle, from having visible muscle, from sweating. That was considered unladylike. There were all sorts of myths about what would happen if you really pushed yourself, from your uterus falling out and not being able to have babies, to like turning into a man in the sense that you would grow hair in unwanted places and get big legs.
If they only knew what was coming.
I know. Yeah. And so that was for me, that was such an interesting place to start, because it's so, it's not that long ago. And it's just so much has changed since then in a relatively short period of time. So it was in the 1950s when women were kind of moving less than ever before. And actually, so were men. It was as more Americans had access to kind of modern conveniences. I mean, everything from, cars to appliances that only required the press of a button.
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly there was a concern for our collective health. Also, from a medical history perspective, a lot of the diseases of the first half of the 20th century, like the infectious diseases, were starting to be cured with vaccines and medication, but now there was a rise in disease born out of abundance, and there was this cardiac crisis that was especially affecting men. Anyway, against this backdrop, there were a few really forward-thinking pioneers who started to become really outspoken evangelists for exercise.
I just want to stop you real there.
Yeah.
Quickly. So I want to kind of go back to that whole World War II, 1940s. And there was a name for the propaganda that America was using at the time, but you can picture those old posters of the women with the bicep,
yeah, the
right? And like
yeah,
the
you can do it.
tool in their hand. And for people who don't know, women were being brought into factories during World War II to produce munitions, bullets and rockets and things like that.
Absolutely.
And then, so that I never correlated. And once that war ended, and these men were coming home, yeah, interesting, yeah, because for years women were pushed into the forefront of being like men. And then so then the current came back, and that's where you kind of picked it up. Okay, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and like so many women, went to work during that period and really found that they enjoyed working. But then were kind of told both explicitly and not so much that they needed to leave their jobs, to make room for men and to be at home, being a homemaker. So yeah,
And the baby boom began.
Exactly. So yeah, it was in that period that a number of pioneers, and I focus in particular on a woman named Bonnie Pruden, began kind of pitching exercise as the antidote to what they called the modern way of life, which was something, the way of life that has only intensified since then, but a more sedentary, comfortable way of life. And at first, for women, it was a real uphill battle, and it wasn't until the late 1960s that actually there was medical consensus on whether exercise was even good for you. Because, and that goes for men as well. There was much more fear around overexertion than underexertion, but that began to change in the late 1960s. And that was when the country's real fitness boom kind of got started.
So okay, well, now this is new to me. Was there an actual pinpoint of a fitness boom where it kind of began? I mean, you could look at other booms like the comedy boom. There was a fitness boom. Okay, how did that even start? Was there a certain person?
I mean, I think if one had to pinpoint it on one person, there was a guy, Dr. Kenneth Cooper, and he had been, I believe he was Surgeon General of the Air Force. He was a military physician, and he wrote a book in 1968 called Aerobics. And he kind of coined the term. Like, the word aerobic had been around, but no, it wasn't part of the vernacular, and it certainly wasn't used the way that we think of it today. But he had done a lot of research with astronauts and airmen and pilots, and had basically shown that, contrary to some of those fears that I mentioned, what cardio, aerobic exercise that strategically stresses the heart and the pulmonary system is actually really beneficial for health. And so he wrote this book. It became a just gigantic bestseller. And it inspired men to start exercising, but it also, it directly, addressed the fact that this was safe and good for women too. And it was also unique because it laid out really specific, it basically quantified exercise. And it said, this is how you can kind of test your fitness level. This is how much you need to be doing. And that was really different than how it had worked before then, because doctors, the ones who were pro exercise, kind of knew it was good for you, but they didn't really know how to prescribe it, And so with this slim, really specific manual in hand, people started
literally.
They started moving. And it was around that time, especially when you look at women's history, that the dance aerobics boom began, or when it sort of first got its start, when running in particular really took off. Dr. Cooper, running was kind of his primary, form of most recommended form of
that was his cardio.
That was And so so that's, and then it kind of just took off and off from there.
Well, when you look at photos, and let's just, you said 1968 is when that book came out. I mean, when you look at photos from 1968 prior, it's rare that you see obese and fat people, right? And I'm curious if there was an intersection at time where the fitness began and diet, so you're talking about a sedentary lifestyle that was maybe introduced after the war. And immediately I'm thinking McDonald's, Wonder Bread, just things that make us fat and lazy. And that kind of maybe ran parallel with this same time frame. In that book, or at that time, was diet even being discussed at all, or was it purely just exercise is how you would lose weight? I mean, was there any correlation?
Yeah, it was. And it's interesting too, because before around, the late 60s, that was another thing. There wasn't even consensus on whether exercise could make you lose weight. And so it was purely diet, really. I mean, with, again, certain doctors sort of being ahead of their time with recommending exercise. You're right. The 50s is known as the golden age of food processing. It's when so many fast food chains were founded, and when the
all of them.
yeah, for the most part, and food really moved from food production, largely moved from the farm to the factory. I mean, that was happening during World War II and before that as well, but that's when it really exploded.
Yeah.
Starting in that decade. And so and I should say, I mean, my research, because this topic of diet and fitness and health is so vast, I kind of had to, I really focused in on the fitness element of it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean,
it's just interesting to talk about because, again, how quickly that changed, that diet, and how quickly people became fat.
I mean, people it was, I think, 1952 that the government declared obesity a national health crisis. And I'm very, I don't like to use that word. That's not the sort of preferred word among body positivity activists. But I think there is sort of a false perception that it's a brand, a relatively new issue, something that the country was has been thinking about for a long time. But I mean, something I talk about in my book is that because and this can even be traced in some ways to the book Aerobics and what began in the late 60s and early 70s, because exercise and fitness has often been kind of positioned as this lifestyle, like an all-consuming lifestyle that, you have to have the right gear and it requires time and it's like, a daily commitment. That's so many Americans and people around the world don't have the luxury of having that time or that access or the money required. And so people just do nothing, which is, I really, I have a lot of compassion for people who find themselves in that situation. And so I think it's like a very American idea that like that kind of Puritan work ethic of go big or go home. And so, but I think, when I talk about kind of how we can maybe increase the movement level of people in this country, I think part of it is maybe advocating for a kinder, gentler approach that's just, even if it's just going for a 20-minute walk a day, it's better than doing nothing.
So this book comes out, Aerobics, in 1968, and now it's kind of in the public consciousness. Where did your research bring you to? So bring us through, now we're into the 70s, and I'm assuming,
Sure.
actresses and things like that are kind of coming into the public eye maybe at that point.
Absolutely. Yeah. Farrah Fawcett was like the real poster child of the kind of sporty, fit lifestyle, especially by the late 70s. She was like the country's it girl.
What was her first big movie? I can't.
Oh, she starred in Charlie's Angels.
That's what it was. Yeah, it was a TV show. Yep.
Yeah, claim to fame. In like 1978, she's on the cover of People. I think it was for running, and the headline was something like "Jogging, everyone's doing it."
Yeah.
The 70s saw the explosion of running. People just like average adults, very few average adults really jogged for fun before the 1970s. And if anything, if you were like jogging down the street, especially as a woman before then, people were like, kind of like, what's wrong with you? But in the 70s, it really became like a trend, you know, and so there was also like during that time, you know, this idea that people treated running as a transcendental experience, which kind of fit with the ethos of that era.
Interesting.
And for women, there were, I mean, it's amazing again how recent this is, but until like, you know, the early 1970s, many athletic officials believed that it was actually dangerous for a woman to run more than 2 miles at a time. So women were banned from most really road races.
Mm.
And in my book, I talk about a few of the running pioneers, like Catherine Spitzer, who was the first woman to run the Boston Marathon with a number in 1967. We worked to change this. When she ran, she had entered the race using her initials, and so they didn't realize she was female. And
Ah,
yeah, when the race director discovered there was a woman in his race 4 miles in, he tackled her and tried to, you know, rip the number off her shirt.
isn't there a famous photo of that?
Yes.
There
Yeah.
is. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember
And
that.
it was, yeah, it was, you know, it was a horrible experience for her. But those photos, when they went around the world, you know, when they made their way around the globe, really helped to bring a lot of attention to the cause. And so, so a lot of, yeah, I read a lot about kind of the fight for opportunities there in the 70s. And there were also some really key innovations during that time, like in 1977, a few women runners invented the sports bra. The sports bra didn't exist before then, which is kind of amazing. And I look at it as, you know, just another more evidence of how little women were encouraged to move before then. So that was happening. And also aerobic dancing. The seeds were planted in really like 1969. That's when jazzercise was first created, and another really popular method. And that gradually took off throughout the 70s. And then in 1978, Jane Fonda opened her first workout studio. So that's all kind of, you know, paving the way for what happened in the 80s.
I saw on your Instagram you posted you had the original brochure from that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
How did you find
Yeah.
that? I mean, that must have been a collectible.
Yeah, well, that actually, it's, you know, that came from a friend of my mother-in-law's actually.
Okay, obviously, yeah.
Yeah. It's, you know, once I started asking around and people knew I was reporting on this topic, a lot of people came out of the woodworks with
Cool.
amazing, you know, sort of memorabilia. And that brochure is in pristine condition too.
I'm sure my mother still has that Suzanne Summers VHS tape.
Yeah.
I'd have to imagine. So a couple of,
Mm-hmm.
in the 70s, are commercial gyms even a thing? I mean, are gyms around, you know, are there places where people can go in and lift weights? I mean, this is how naive I feel about this timeline and the structure. I mean, was that
Right. No,
happening
you're not naive. Most people don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there were gyms. I mean, gyms for much of the 20th century had this sort of reputation of being these kind of seedy, like underground type places. There was a lot of stigma against men who pumped iron as well. You know, this belief that kind of like brain and brawn were not compatible. And so, but they're starting in about the 50s, I think. You know, there were a few like fitness entrepreneurs who started to introduce more of this idea of the luxury gym that was kind of the predecessor of what we see today. But in general, what was really significant in the 70s was that, well, for one, as the fitness boom swept the country, more multi-purpose gyms and health clubs started to open up. You know, these like multiplexes with racquetball courts and machines and people. And then also in about the mid 70s, starting then, gyms started to become co-ed for the first time.
Okay.
Before then, they weren't. There were some gyms where women were allowed to, like, you know, enter, but there would be special ladies' days. So it wasn't, they would never be working out at the same time as men.
Yeah.
So gyms became co-ed because there was more of a demand. They became these sprawling like social hubs. And that's also kind of when the idea of like the gym as this sexy, singles scene got its start, which really intensified heading into the 80s. But also it was before really like the late 70s, women really didn't lift weights. So if a woman was going to go to one of these gyms, it was more to, use machines, jog, swim. And then that really began to change also in the late 70s, heading into the 80s.
So Jane Fonda opens up this beautiful place, and I'm assuming in Los Angeles.
In Beverly Hills, yeah, and it was
Course.
beautiful, yeah, but it was also kind of bare bones. It was like she really, Jane Fonda was really at that time she was married to Tom Hayden, the political activist.
Okay, yeah.
And was like she like famously slept on a mattress on the floor, and so she wanted this to be, the studio was opened exclusively to fund Tom Hayden's political PAC.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and help get him elected to the California State Assembly.
Okay.
Every single dollar she made was funneled into that. And so, yeah, I mean, it was in Beverly Hills, but it was pretty no frills.
Sure. So but she opens this up, and maybe this kind of opens up more public consciousness of what is going to happen maybe coming into the 80s. So was there a specific woman or a specific person who kind of took the reins, and did it really kind of blast open into the next decade?
Yes. I mean, it was this collective build kind of,
Yeah.
but Jane Fonda really tipped it over the edge. So she opened her studio, and it was very popular from the beginning. I mean, it was really like, as it probably would be today too, she was this major celebrity, and she was teaching classes, and for her, like, people wanted to check it out.
Totally.
And she was also, I think, 43 when she opened it. So it was something new, that a woman could be in her 40s and, still be considered beautiful and working out in a leotard. And then, so the studio led to a book deal, which, the book, her first Jane Fonda workout book, similar story, became a huge bestseller. And it was like on the top of the New York Times bestseller list for many weeks. And then that led to her workout video, which was created at a time when like not that many people even owned VCRs.
Sure. This is the early to mid 80s.
This was 82. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So she was approached by this guy who was a young home video, entrepreneur, kind of visionary. But he, like, when he first approached her, she said she had never purchased a video. Like, no one she knew had ever purchased a VHS tape. She was like, why?
I'm talking to someone about an NFT right now. Like, what?
Yeah, exactly. Like, what? Yeah. She was already releasing a record to go along with her book. She's like, why do I need more than that? Yeah. And he eventually convinced her. And the video is actually credited with helping to launch the entire home video industry, because yeah, like before then, people didn't really get like why you would need to or want to watch a movie so many times that you had to own it. It's so different from today. But with a workout video, if you wanted to see, results, you needed to do it regularly. Yeah. Her video became, like, for a while, it was the best-selling home video of all time. It sold 17 million copies. And that it also expanded access to women all over the world, who could afford the tape and a VCR. And then there were, between that and Jazzercise, which by the early 80s was like the country's second biggest franchise behind Domino's Pizza, which is funny. Yeah. It then inspired women not only to want to work out, but also to want to teach. And it it grew and grew from there. It also launched the fitness home video industry, which it's like, I mean, that's just an amazing archive of material. By the end of the 80s, there were like 500 fitness videos being produced every year.
And now this is where it comes into my head, because
Uh-huh.
for sake of conversation, I was born in 1987, but I
Okay.
remember, some of my earliest memories are like seeing this thing in my mother's closet, and it was like this
Mhm.
weird looking thing. And as like a 4-year-old, you're like, you're doing all the weird stuff.
Right,
And
right.
I remember she had all the videos, she did all the things. And as a kid, you're not thinking about this kind of stuff. But as I got older, and you look back on that, and I would think to myself, that took a lot of dedication to do. It took a
Mhm.
lot of, determination, just like willpower, because like you said, this was at home fitness. You're not going
Mhm.
to the gym. You're not, no one's spotting you. No one's like in
Right,
your ear being like, good job.
right, right.
So yeah, it took a certain kind of person to even want to do that on their own.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and it, I mean, the thing that's interesting is with women's fitness, it had always, from even the early days in the 1950s, it really was always tied to beauty and appearance and weight loss. And that was kind of how some of the earliest pioneers made exercise acceptable for women, because of it like you couldn't go from saying from not working out to being like trying to convince women to do push-ups and have
Yeah,
bulging
that'd be
biceps.
gradual. Yeah.
It was, yeah, and it was kind of, in the book I talk about it as like broccoli dipped in chocolate. It was kind of selling this strength in the package of beauty.
Mhm.
And but as the decades went on for women, there was also, that was kind of coupled with these really ever increasing beauty standards. And I think when you think about even the name thigh master, kind of
Sure.
what's that, what's that telling women? It's like that if we don't work hard, our thighs or whatever body part will just spiral out of control.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there was a lot of motivation among many, many women at that time and before and after to use the tools that were available to try
Mhm.
to, attain or maintain a certain physique.
Mhm. So now that this brings us through the 80s, and I'm assuming the 90s too. I'm not sure. Were there
Mhm.
any significant changes in the next decade with in regards to women's fitness?
Um, yeah, so the late 80s into the 90s was really the era of like, I interviewed the star of the Buns of Steel series,
I,
Tammy Lee Webb.
I don't know that one.
Oh yeah, oh yeah, it Buns of Steel, and then there were like Abs of Steel.
Oh, okay, yeah. Mhm,
There's a
mhm.
great scene in the movie Clueless where Cher is trying to give Ty a makeover, and they're like doing the Buns of Steel workout, and she's like, "This my
I do have
buns."
a sister. Yes, I
Yeah,
remember these things.
yeah, okay.
Okay.
So yeah, that's when there was more of this focus. It wasn't just doing aerobics, it wasn't just working out. Then it was like women wanted to have, you know, like hard bodies.
Sure.
And that's also Buns of Steel and the Thigh Master came out at around the same time. There was more of a trend toward that kind of strength training or building muscle, but with the goal of kind of being as sleek and
Yeah.
compact as possible. And then what started to happen was in as the 90s continued, a lot of women were really getting burnt out, from often well-meaning fitness gurus who stress that it did have to be this kind of everyday commitment.
Mhm.
Also, a lot of the early aerobics instructors weren't, that well trained, and so there were injuries. And also by the 90s, a lot of the women who had started working out in the 70s or 80s were really reaching middle age.
Mhm.
And so the 90s was when we saw the boom in yoga.
Mhm.
Because people were burnt out, they were kind of over the many people were over the big multiplex health club, And yoga offered something really different. And so that was when, I mean, yoga has a extremely long history, as you can imagine. It was not by any means invented in the 90s. And
Wasn't invented in Boston, no?
what's that?
Said it wasn't invented in Boston?
No, no. I mean, shocking, I know, but that was when it went. There was a point in the 70s where it was really, really popular, and there's this great Time article where they declare yoga as being as American as apple pie. But that then with like the rise of gyms and aerobics and this more hardcore mentality, it kind of faded away. And then in the 90s was when it just came back in
Okay.
force. And it was really helped by these huge celebrities who got into it, like Madonna, these supermodels. And it was just, it was like it was the workout du jour. It also helped women kind of achieve the body du jour. The 90s, once we kind of moved out of the buns of steel era a little bit, it was that more long, lanky, I mean, the extreme example is Kate Moss, but that like willowy, really thin figure, which yoga, promised women.
Well, I have a quick, I want to stop you there.
Yeah.
Did your research bring you, as you're studying this, are you also examining what's happening in popular culture at the time? So in the night, I'm assuming with, these trends, also women are being, there's media, right? There's magazines, there's photo, there's an image being pushed out as well.
Yeah.
Was the image changing along with the whatever fitness might have been? So when Abs of Steel was around, were there a lot of women with just like ripped six packs? And then did your research bring you through that?
Definitely. I mean, that was something that I was most interested in exploring. Both the ways pop culture influenced body ideals and vice versa. There were some, great examples along the way, like Linda Hamilton in Terminator 2, when she showed up with these like really, just ripped basically. Suddenly, whereas before women were trying to, we're just so afraid of bulk, which has not totally gone away, but now women like wanted those arms, So, I mean, that I tried as best I could to kind of follow that thread and look at why certain bodies were being really, held up as aspirational and others faded away. And you can go even, part of my job as a cultural historian and commentator is to kind of, look maybe even deeper and looking at how politics, what was happening more broadly on a social level in the country, and what was happening with women's kind of stature in society was also affecting the types of workouts we did and the types of bodies that we were aspiring to.
So the 90s happens, all these things. I kind of want to get, and if we're skipping over something, let me know, but only because nowadays, body image is just, it's shoved in your face. I mean, all day, right? All day, constantly. And I can only speak as a male, right?
Yeah.
But I started taking my fitness pretty seriously about 5 years ago. I kind of grew up as like just a normal chubby kid, but I contribute that more to my diet growing up as opposed to, I was always an active person, but my mother would buy Oreos and soda. And if you eat that, you'll get, you won't be skinny. That being said, as I got older, I started looking at body positivity in a positive way. So it was a goal to achieve as opposed to being a negative feeling where I felt I'm not good enough.
Right, a punishment. Yeah.
Exactly. I'm sure you do you talk about social media in the book? Does it get that far into how that affects, especially women nowadays? I mean, I can name a couple of people in my life who are deeply affected by that kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah, it does. And I mean, to be honest, I wish if I had like 100 more pages in the book, I could probably.
Next book.
Yeah. I will say, and this is partly because the book in many ways is a celebration of, you know, women's strength and these pioneers and how far we've come. So while I talk a little bit about the negative, the like vast sort of abyss that social media can be when it comes to toxic body ideals, I also focus on some of the more positive aspects of social media has brought us, which is just so much more representation and diversity in terms of bodies and fitness than we've really ever seen.
Mhm.
And so, you know, I interview and I profile the yoga guru, Jessamine Stanley, in the book. And she, I don't know, are you familiar with Jessamine?
No, I mean, I've been practicing yoga for 10 years now, but no, the names escape me. I'm not in.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So she's, you know, has an incredible story. She describes herself as being, I mean, she's much larger than your typical yoga icon. She's Black, she's queer, and she has built this tremendous following. And it really started with her home yoga practice that she started documenting on social media. And she talks about, you know, just people for the first time, they had never seen themselves reflected in the yoga community. And so there are kind of Jessamines, and many of them in every realm of fitness. And I think, you know, if you look at I'm curious, I kind of want to see how this has changed for like men as well. I've been so focused on women, but so many of the popular like athleisure brands now, from Athleta to even Lululemon, which, you know, really got in trouble a few years ago for saying their clothes like were only for thin women. Now their models are a range of sizes. There's so many women's magazines that were only showed one type of model, now show so much more of an array. And that's a lot of that. Like if you talk to body positivity fitness activists, I really believe that came largely from the conversation that was happening on social media. There was one woman I interviewed who put it really well. She said something like, what you see on social media are the people who have always been in the majority, like in number, but not in voice or not in power. And because it's now, whereas before it was just like magazines and pop culture and everything sort of telling us how to be and how to look, it's now a two-way conversation where people can respond. And so there's a lot of really positive stuff that's happening there. But you just have to, it sometimes takes some work to find the accounts and the
and if you disagree with me, please disagree with me, but I notice that, you know, it's almost they go opposite ways. So the more in general popular culture that body positivity is pushed with women, it's almost the opposite with men, where nowadays it feels like, you know, like who had ever heard of a dad bod 2 years ago? like to me, like as a guy who goes to the gym and works out to make myself feel better and to, you know, to give myself confidence, et cetera, et cetera. Now I'm being told, you know, all the women I'm trying to date are like, I only want to date a guy who's got a belly. And like, you know, so it's like, it's almost always been the opposite.
Right.
It's weird how that happens.
That's so interesting. I mean, and that's not, I can't, like, I want to do more. I want to kind of explore that more. But I think, you know, I mean, I know that if you think about it, one explanation might be that as women are becoming more accepting of themselves and their own bodies and feeling but like I could imagine someone feeling like self-conscious if they're with someone who is really whose standards for their own physique are really high.
Sure.
So if you think about it, you know, if you're both kind of, accepting of having a little bit of a punch, then that might feel more comfortable.
No, totally. But the fact that it even turns into a hashtag, right? I'm just saying it's so different now. It's so different nowadays how, how this information gets put out to us in a positive way or a negative way.
Yeah. Is that something that makes you feel self-conscious? If are you,
Again, totally. And I preface, and I'm happy you asked that. Usually people get pissed off when I talk about myself on the podcast. I try not to. I preface that by saying I grew up as a chubby kid. So that little chubby dude will always be deep in the darkest parts of my soul. So when I work out and, I practice, I do jujitsu, I box, I'm an active guy. So I do take pride in that, right? Because to me, like I said with my mother, like it shows to me determination, strong will. If I have that, ultimately, I would look for that in, let's just say, a partner. With that being said, does it make me, I don't know. I mean, if women want to date a guy with a dad bod, I'm not going to just eat Chinese food and not work out anymore. At the end of the day, it really should be about yourself. And I'd like to think that women at the end of the day, when they get done with the workout, they feel good about themselves. I'd hope that's the case. I'd hope that continues to be the case.
Yeah. I mean, the more I think about it, it seems like, it had that sort of, requirement or preference has more to do, doesn't even have that much to do with like the actual like person's physical appearance. It's not like a strong attack. It's not like they have this like strong animal magnetism to a little punch. It's more the perceived judgment of some people who are just like totally devoted to shaping their bodies. And I think like, I mean, I do think in the past few years, especially too, there's been a lot more conversation about all of the reasons why we exercise that have nothing to do with the way we look, like mental health, emotional health, all of the attributes you just mentioned that you admired in your mom, perseverance. And so I think, I think we're kind of seeing a little bit of a backlash to the culture of the 80s and the 90s and the early 2000s of like this hardcore gym, six-pack ab mentality. But as the conversation like becomes more, sort of as we expand it to talk about things beyond reasons why you might work out beyond how you look, I think it might level out a little bit,
And it's like, and I hope that gets talked about more because, when you go to a therapist and you tell them you're depressed, rather than ask the general questions of, well, what's your diet like? Are you exercising? Here's a pill. But when I started exercising, the mind and body correlation was almost instantaneous, where I would get done with a really hard workout and afterwards I would feel almost high, in a sense of this. And once I kind of started tapping into that, then it turned into like a snake eating itself. Well, if I make myself feel better, I'll feel better in my head. And then it continues that way.
Totally.
And that, again, I feel like that doesn't get talked about enough. Even we're in COVID times, how often do you hear people saying, instead of, maybe you should exercise a little more and take some vitamins and, it's almost like they're not getting pushed into the forefront, maybe for a reason. I don't know. Kellogg's needs to make cereal still. So
yeah. I mean, the high that you talk about, there are chemicals that are released when we exercise. Obviously, everyone knows about like endorphins, but there's a whole host, a whole cocktail of chemicals, and can vary depending on the type of exercise you're doing, but that really have been shown to have a
join the conversation.
Sure. Can help with anxiety and depression. And I mean, one reason why I connected with this topic was because I am a lifelong runner. I mean, really jogger, but and for me, not only do I like sort of feel that endorphin high, but I'm able to apply so many of the lessons that I've learned through running to other parts of my life. Like particularly, I ran a marathon a few years ago, and I can't tell you how often, you know, if I'm going through a difficult time or whatever, I draw on what I learned, and I say, you know, if I could, okay, I'm at mile 21. If I can just kind of like push through, you know, I'll get there. And so I think that's really real for a lot of people, that feeling of pride and self-reliance that is, you know, totally separate from our physical appearance or weight loss or anything like that.
It's a mind-body connection, I think.
Very much.
Yeah. And again, I'm not going to sit here and say that this is not, you know, working out is not easy. Running a marathon is not easy. You know, like going to jujitsu is not easy to do. And there are days where I feel like I just don't want to do it anyways. I'm sure there are days you feel like you don't want to run anyways.
Yeah, of course.
But you know what, if you do it, how you're going to feel after. And, you know, I think of it as the snake eating itself kind of thing.
Right. And I think, I mean, and this is just my general approach, and always has been as kind of a women's health reporter and a writer, but I really believe in moving in a way that feels good. And so if for some people, given what else they have going on in their life and their health level and things like that, their fitness level, if that is going for a brisk walk once a day, you know, great. If that is training for a marathon, like moving in a way that feels good does not have to mean moving in a way that's easy. You know, it's just listening to your body at that moment in time and that stage of life, and finding the form of movement that brings you joy, you know? So, but it's hard because there are so many cultural messages, especially in this country, that kind of suggest that, you know, harder, faster is better. And that's not always the case.
Yeah. Danielle, this has been an absolute pleasure. I'm sure, I know some people are going to really dig this one. A couple things real quick. Are you on Twitter, Instagram? Where can people kind of follow this journey that you're taking people through?
Yeah. Well, I'm most active on Instagram.
Okay. What's your handle?
Danielle Friedman Writes.
Great.
And I also, if you're curious, for people who are curious, I really track the entire process of researching this book and share a lot of fun, sometimes like absurd visuals from the crazy archives of fitness history. I'm also on Twitter, D Friedman Writes. Those are the main places to find me.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. Other than that, I mean, and the book is called Let's Get Physical, and it comes out next month, right?
It comes out next week, actually.
Oh, there it is. Yeah. I wish I had a copy of it. You know, I didn't have that. I would have had the digital copy behind my head the whole time.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Can you hold up the cover one more time for people to see? Because I do like that.
Absolutely.
Okay. Is that a specific? Is that?
No, it's not.
Okay.
There is a photo insert.
I thought it was Farrah Fawcett.
It could be. She's sort of meant to be. She can be whoever readers want her to be.
I love it.